The chapel smelled like lilies and regret. That's what Margaret Chen noticed first as she stepped through the heavy oak doors. Not the soft organ music drifting from hidden speakers, not the rows of polished pews filled with strangers in black, but that cloying sweetness that funeral homes pump into the air to mask something deeper, something true. The scent clung to the back of her throat as she paused in the doorway, her worn leather purse pressed against her hip, her eyes adjusting to the dim, amber-filtered light. She was late. Not terribly late, but late enough that heads turned when the door creaked shut behind her. Late enough that she felt the weight of those glances, quick, assessing, dismissive, before they returned to the closed casket at the front of the room. Margaret had dressed carefully that morning. Her black dress was simple, pressed, appropriate. She'd pinned her silver hair back with the same tortoiseshell clip she'd worn to her own mother's funeral 30 years ago. She'd even brought tissues, folded neatly in her purse, next to her reading glasses, and the memorial card she'd received in the mail 3 days earlier. James William Foster, 1951 to 2025. Beloved father, grandfather, friend. She didn't recognize the name at first, not until she saw the photograph, black and white, formal, the kind taken in a department store studio with a soft focus background. Then it clicked. Not James, never James. Everyone who knew him called him Bill. Bill from the park. Bill, who sat on the same bench every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, feeding pigeons from a paper bag and talking to anyone who'd listen about his daughter in Seattle, his grandkids who never called enough, the weather, baseball, the way the neighborhood used to be. Bill, who'd helped her carry groceries up the 3 flights to her apartment when her knee was bad. Bill, who'd asked her about her husband, dead now 15 years, and actually listened to her answer. Bill, who'd told her just 2 months ago that he didn't have much family left in the area, that when his time came, he hoped someone would remember him kindly. She'd promised she would. So here she was, standing in a chapel full of people she'd never seen before, watching them cry for a man they called James. Margaret made her way down the side aisle, her low heels clicking softly against the tile. She chose a seat near the back, next to an older woman with a black veil and a younger man who kept checking his phone under the program. Nobody looked at her. Nobody acknowledged her arrival, beyond those first curious glances. The service began with a prayer, then a hymn. Then a pastor Margaret didn't recognize stepped up to the podium and began speaking about James William Foster, his service in Vietnam, his career in accounting, his love of golf, his devotion to his church. Margaret's brow furrowed. Bill had never mentioned Vietnam. He'd worked in a hardware store for 40 years. He couldn't stand golf, called it a waste of good walking time. And church? Bill had told her once, with a wry smile, that he preferred his sermons delivered by pigeons and sunshine. She glanced down at the program in her lap. James William Foster, born March 14, 1951, in Richmond, Virginia. Bill was born in June, in Ohio. He'd told her about the humid summers there, the fireflies, the way his mother made lemonade with too much sugar and not enough ice. Margaret's chest tightened. She looked up at the casket again, at the flower arrangements flanking it, white roses, carnations, baby's breath, at the photograph on the easel beside it, enlarged and professionally framed. The man in the picture looked like Bill, same broad forehead, same deep-set eyes. But something was off. The smile was different, tighter, more formal. And the photograph itself seemed wrong, too crisp, too posed. A woman in the front row stood and approached the podium. She introduced herself as Jennifer, the deceased's daughter. Her voice cracked as she spoke about her father's kindness, his quiet strength, his final months spent in a care facility where the staff said he never stopped smiling. Margaret's hands went cold. Bill didn't have a daughter named Jennifer. His daughter's name was Carol, and he hadn't been in a care facility. He'd lived independently in the small apartment building on Elm Street, the one with the red door and the creaky mailboxes. She'd seen him just 3 weeks ago. The chapel suddenly felt smaller, hotter. The lilies pressed in from all sides, their perfume turning rancid in her nose. Margaret rose quietly from her seat and moved toward the back of the chapel, her heart hammering against her ribs. At the welcome table near the entrance, a guest book lay open, its pages filled with signatures and condolences. She flipped back to the first page. In loving memory of James William Foster. Service held at Riverside Memorial Chapel, October 24, 2025. Her finger traced down the names. Davidson, Mitchell, Yamamoto, Foster, Hernandez. Strangers, all of them. She turned toward the casket one more time, her breath shallow, her mind racing. If this was James William Foster's funeral, then where was Bill? Margaret Chen had lived in the same neighborhood for 43 years. She'd moved into the walk-up apartment on Elm Street in 1982, newly widowed, newly adrift, carrying everything she owned in 7 cardboard boxes and a canvas duffel bag her husband had brought back from the Navy. The neighborhood wasn't fashionable then. It wasn't fashionable now, but it was hers. The bodega on the corner knew she took her coffee black with 1 sugar. The bus driver on the number 12 line saved her the seat behind him when the morning rush got bad. The superintendent, Miguel, always shoveled her front steps first after a snowstorm. She knew the rhythm of the place, the hiss of the radiator in winter, the way the streetlight outside her window flickered every night at 9:47. The sound of Mrs. Patterson's television bleeding through the walls, always game shows, always too loud. And she knew the people. Not everyone, not like she used to, when the neighborhood was smaller, tighter, when people still sat on stoops and shared cigarettes and gossip in equal measure. But she knew enough. The young couple in 3B who fought every Sunday. The man in 1A who played trumpet badly but with enthusiasm. The mail carrier who always whistled show tunes. And Bill. She'd met him 5 years ago, maybe 6. It was hard to pinpoint exactly when their friendship began because it had grown so gradually, so naturally, like moss on the north side of a tree. One day she was walking through Morrison Park on her way to the library, and there he was, an older man with steel-gray hair and laugh lines etched deep around his eyes, tossing breadcrumbs to a gaggle of pigeons that swarmed his feet like a feathered tide. "They say you're not supposed to feed them," he'd said without looking up, his voice gravelly but warm. "But I figure they gotta eat too, don't they?" She'd smiled, nodded, kept walking. The next week he was there again. Same bench, same pigeons, same casual greeting thrown out like a lifeline to anyone passing by. By the 3rd week, she sat down beside him. They talked about nothing at first, the weather, the state of the park, how the rose garden used to be better maintained, how the fountain had been dry for 2 summers running. Bill had a way of talking that was easy, undemanding. He didn't pry, didn't fill silences with nervous chatter. He just was. Margaret appreciated that. After so many years alone, she'd grown wary of people who wanted too much energy, too much explanation, too much of the person she used to be before grief had hollowed her out and reshaped her into something quieter. Bill didn't want anything. He just offered companionship, freely given, with no strings attached. Over time, their conversations deepened. He told her about his daughter Carol, who lived in Seattle and worked in something tech-related that he didn't fully understand but was proud of anyway. He told her about his late wife, Dorothy, who'd loved mystery novels and terrible puns, and died too young from something that started in her lungs and spread before they could stop it. He told her about the hardware store where he'd worked for 40 years, how he could still smell sawdust and paint thinner if he closed his eyes and tried. She told him about her husband, Thomas, about the empty space he'd left behind, about how some losses don't get smaller with time, they just become part of the architecture of who you are. Bill understood. He didn't say much in response, but she could see it in his eyes. He understood. Their friendship became a fixture. Tuesdays and Thursdays, weather permitting, they'd meet at the bench. Sometimes they'd talk. Sometimes they'd just sit in comfortable silence, watching the world move around them. Joggers with their earbuds in, mothers pushing strollers, teenagers cutting through the park on their way to somewhere more interesting. Margaret started looking forward to those afternoons. She'd plan her week around them. Tuesdays and Thursdays. Bill and the pigeons and the comfortable quiet. But 3 weeks ago, he wasn't there. She'd waited for 20 minutes, then 30, telling herself he'd probably just been delayed. Doctor's appointment maybe, or his daughter called, or he simply decided to stay home. It wasn't like Bill to be late, though. He was punctual in the way old men often are, creatures of habit, comforted by routine. The next Thursday, the bench was empty again. Margaret felt a flutter of worry then, small but persistent. She walked past his building on her way home, the one with the red door on Elm Street, just 2 blocks from her own. She even went inside, checked the mailboxes in the vestibule. His box, Foster 2C, was overflowing with junk mail and flyers. She didn't go upstairs, didn't knock on his door. It felt like an invasion somehow, like crossing a line their friendship hadn't quite reached. But the worry stayed with her. Then, 3 days ago, the memorial card arrived. It was slipped under her door in a plain white envelope. No postage, no return address. Just her name written in neat block letters on the front. James William Foster, 1951-2025. Memorial service, Friday, October 24, 2 p.m., Riverside Memorial Chapel. She'd stared at it for a long time, the card trembling slightly in her hands. James, not Bill, but the dates matched. 74 years old, the right age, and the service was local. It had to be him. She felt the grief then, sudden and sharp. Not the deep soul-crushing grief she'd felt when Thomas died, but something quieter. The loss of a friend, the end of Tuesdays and Thursdays, the knowledge that the bench in Morrison Park would be empty from now on, and she'd have to find a new rhythm, a new routine. She decided she would go to the service, pay her respects, maybe meet his daughter Carol if she came in from Seattle, maybe learn a little more about the man who'd shared breadcrumbs and stories with her for 5 years. She owed him that much. So she dressed carefully, pressed her black dress, pinned her hair, folded tissues into her purse beside the memorial card. And now she stood in the back of a chapel that smelled like lilies and regret, staring at a casket that might not hold her friend at all. Her mind spun, grasping for an explanation that made sense. Maybe she'd been wrong about the daughter's name. Memory could be slippery, especially at her age. Maybe he'd mentioned Jennifer once, and she'd conflated it with Carol. Maybe Bill had used his full name, James, in formal settings, even if everyone called him Bill. But the photograph, the biography, Vietnam, golf, the care facility, none of it fit. Margaret's breath came shallow and fast. She felt a flush creeping up her neck, part panic, part confusion. Around her, the mourners continued their rituals, weeping softly, embracing, sharing hushed stories about a man she increasingly suspected she'd never met. She backed toward the exit, her movements slow and deliberate, trying not to draw attention. Her hand found the door handle, cool brass, solid, real. She needed air. She needed to think. But as she pushed the door open, a voice stopped her. "Excuse me?" Margaret turned. A young woman stood a few feet away, mid-30s maybe, with dark hair pulled into a professional bun and eyes red-rimmed from crying. "I'm sorry," the woman said, her voice soft. "I saw you leaving, and I just wanted to say thank you for coming. It means a lot that people showed up. Dad didn't have many friends toward the end." Margaret's throat tightened. I'm sorry for your loss." The woman nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Were you from the Veterans Association? He talked about his service sometimes, but we never met many of his military friends." "No," Margaret said carefully. I knew him from the neighborhood." "Oh," the woman's expression shifted slightly, uncertain. "That's nice. I didn't realize he'd kept in touch with neighbors. He was in the care facility for the last 6 months, so—" 6 months. Margaret's chest constricted. 6 months ago, Bill had been sitting on the bench in Morrison Park, feeding pigeons and complaining about the price of coffee. "I think," Margaret said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think there might be a mistake." The woman, Jennifer, she'd introduced herself as, stared at Margaret with a mixture of confusion and concern. "A mistake?" Jennifer repeated. "I'm not sure I understand." Margaret's mind raced. How did you tell someone on the day of their father's funeral that you suspected they were burying the wrong man? How did you explain that the person you'd known, the person you'd laughed with, shared silence with, mourned alongside, seemed to be someone entirely different from the man being eulogized inside that chapel? "I knew a man named Bill Foster," Margaret began, her words careful, measured. "We met in Morrison Park. For years we'd sit together, talk. He told me about his life, his family, his daughter Carol." Jennifer's brow furrowed. "Carol?" "His daughter, in Seattle. She worked in tech," he said. "My name is Jennifer," the younger woman said, her tone growing cooler, "and I live in Baltimore, not Seattle. I'm a high school teacher, not whatever tech is supposed to mean." Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. "But he said—" "I think you have the wrong person," Jennifer interrupted, not unkindly, but with the firm politeness of someone who wanted to end an uncomfortable conversation. "My father was James William Foster. He served in Vietnam. He worked in accounting for 38 years. He loved golf and crime novels and watching the Orioles. And for the last 6 months of his life, he was in Riverside Care Center, where he passed peacefully in his sleep 4 days ago." Each detail landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of doubt through Margaret's certainty. "I'm sorry," Jennifer continued, her voice softening. "I know grief can be confusing. Maybe you knew someone with a similar name. Or maybe—" She trailed off, the implication clear. "Maybe you're mistaken. Maybe your memory isn't what it used to be. Maybe you're confused." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to insist, but the weight of Jennifer's grief, her red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands, made the words stick in her throat. "I'm sorry," Margaret said instead. "I didn't mean to intrude." She turned and pushed through the chapel doors, stepping out into the crisp autumn afternoon. The sun was too bright after the dim interior. She blinked against it, her eyes watering, her hands shaking as she fumbled in her purse for her sunglasses. Her car was parked 2 blocks away. She walked slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. Maybe Jennifer was right. Maybe Margaret had gotten confused. Maybe the man in the casket was Bill, and she'd simply misremembered details, conflated stories, let her aging mind play tricks on her. But as she reached her car, a 15-year-old Honda Civic with a dent in the rear bumper and a rosary hanging from the rearview mirror, Margaret paused. She pulled out the memorial card again, studying it in the afternoon light. James William Foster, born March 14, 1951. Bill's birthday was in June. She was certain of it. He'd mentioned it once, complained about how birthday parties in summer were never as fun as kids, because everyone was always on vacation. June, not March. Margaret sat in her car for a long time, the engine off, the windows down, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Then she started the car and drove to Morrison Park. The bench was empty. Of course it was. It was Friday, not Tuesday or Thursday, and Bill was gone. But Margaret sat down anyway, her purse on the bench beside her, her hands folded in her lap. The park was quiet this time of day. A few joggers, a woman walking a terrier, teenagers smoking cigarettes behind the maintenance shed, their laughter carrying across the brown grass. She thought about Bill, really thought about him, tried to separate memory from assumption, fact from feeling. He'd always been vague about certain things, she realized now. He never mentioned exactly where he lived, just over on Elm. Never gave his apartment number. Never invited her over for coffee or dinner, the way some friendships naturally progressed. And she'd never pushed. She'd respected his boundaries, the way she hoped he respected hers. But now, sitting on their bench, she wondered if there was more to it than boundaries. She'd seen his mailbox, hadn't she? Foster, 2C. She'd seen the overflowing mail 3 weeks ago, the day he first didn't show up. Margaret stood abruptly, her decision made. She was going to Elm Street. The building with the red door stood 4 blocks from Morrison Park, wedged between a dry cleaner and a Vietnamese restaurant that always smelled like star anise and fried garlic. Margaret had walked past it 1,000 times. She'd even been inside once or twice, back when her friend Eileen lived in 3A, before Eileen moved to Florida to be near her son. The vestibule was small and poorly lit. 8 mailboxes lined the left wall, dented and scratched, their labels faded from years of sun exposure and neglect. Margaret scanned them quickly. 1A, Rodriguez. 1B, J. Patterson. 2A, Ma Okongwo. 2B, empty. 2C, Foster. 3A, Chen Davis. 3B, L. Washington. 4A, Superintendent. Foster, 2C. Her breath caught. The mailbox was still overflowing. Junk mail jutted out at odd angles, a rolled-up newspaper wedged in the gap where the door didn't quite close. No one had collected the mail in weeks. Margaret stood there for a long moment, staring at that name. Foster. Then she did something she'd never done before, something that felt both intrusive and necessary. She climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor. The hallway smelled like old carpet and someone's dinner, onions maybe, and something vaguely sweet. The walls were painted a dingy cream that might have once been white. The doors were numbered in brass plates that had tarnished to a dull brown. 2C was at the end of the hall. Margaret knocked softly, once, twice. No answer. She tried the knob. Locked. He's gone. Margaret spun around. A woman stood in the doorway of 2A, arms crossed, her expression somewhere between suspicious and curious. She was younger than Margaret, maybe mid-50s, with box-braided hair and a Nationals t-shirt. "I'm sorry," Margaret said. "The man in 2C, Foster, he moved out about 3 weeks ago. Middle of the night, actually. I heard the moving truck. Woke me up around 2 a.m. Margaret's pulse quickened. "Moved out? Where?" The woman shrugged. "Didn't say. Didn't leave a forwarding address with Miguel, far as I know. Just gone. Truck came, he loaded up, and that was that." Was he sick? Did he look like he needed help?" "Looked fine to me. In a hurry, but fine." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why? You a friend of his, or something?" "Yes," Margaret said. "Yes, I think I was." "Well, he didn't mention any friends. Kept to himself mostly. Quiet guy. Paid his rent on time. No complaints." She paused. "Though, now that you mention it, there was something weird." "Weird how?" "Couple of guys came by about a week after he left. Official-looking types. Suits and briefcases. Asked Miguel about Foster. Wanted to know where he went. Miguel told them he didn't know, and they weren't happy about it. Left their cards. Said to call if Foster came back. Margaret's skin prickled. Did they say who they were? Some kind of legal firm, I think. I didn't catch the name. But they were insistent. Said it was important they find him. Did they seem threatening? The woman considered. Not threatening exactly, but not friendly either. Like they had something over him, something he owed or something they needed him for. Margaret thanked the woman and descended the stairs slowly, her mind whirling. Bill, or whoever he was, hadn't died. He'd disappeared. Which meant the funeral she'd just attended, the service with the closed casket and the tearful daughter and the biography that didn't fit. That was someone else entirely. Margaret sat in her apartment that evening, the lights off, the city's glow filtering through her thin curtains and casting everything in shades of orange and gray. She'd made tea, let it go cold. Made more, let that go cold too. Her mind kept circling back to the same questions. If Bill hadn't died, why had someone sent her that memorial card? Who was James William Foster, the man they'd buried today? And why did he look so much like Bill? She thought about calling the police, but what would she say? That she'd gone to a funeral for someone who might not be the person she thought? That a man she knew from the park had moved away without saying goodbye? That she suspected. What, exactly? She had no proof, no evidence, just a growing sense that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Around 10 p.m., she picked up her phone. It took her 20 minutes to find the number, buried in an old address book, written in fading ink next to a name she hadn't thought about in years. Carol Foster. Margaret had written it down 3 years ago, after Bill mentioned his daughter was getting married. He'd been upset about it, not about the marriage itself, but about the fact that he couldn't afford to fly to Seattle for the wedding. Money was tight, he'd said. Retirement wasn't what he'd hoped it would be. Margaret had offered to help. He'd refused, gently but firmly. Pride, she understood. She had her own. But she'd written down Carol's number anyway, just in case. Just in case Bill ever needed something and was too proud to ask. Just in case. She stared at the number now, her thumb hovering over the call button. It was late. 10 p.m. here meant 7 p.m. in Seattle. Still reasonable. She pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Hello? The voice was young, female, uncertain, the tone people use when answering unknown numbers. Is this Carol Foster? Margaret asked. A pause. Who's calling? My name is Margaret Chen. I'm calling about your father, Bill.
Another pause. Longer this time. I think you have the wrong number. Please, Margaret said quickly, before the woman could hang up. I'm a friend of your father's, from Morrison Park. We used to meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He told me about you, about Seattle, about your work, about... Lady, I don't know who you are, the voice interrupted, sharper now, defensive. But you definitely have the wrong number. My father passed away 6 years ago, heart attack, and his name was Robert, not Bill. But... The line went dead. Margaret sat in the darkness, her phone still pressed to her ear, listening to the silence. Wrong number. It had to be a wrong number. But Bill had been so specific. Carol Foster? Seattle? Tech industry? Unless he'd been lying. The thought settled over her like a cold fog. She didn't want to believe it, didn't want to think that the man she'd shared so many afternoons with, the man who'd seemed so genuine, so kind, had been feeding her stories, inventing a life. But why would he do that? Margaret stood and walked to her window, looking out over the street below. A few pedestrians hurried past. A bus hissed to a stop at the corner. Somewhere a dog barked. Ordinary life, ordinary evening. But nothing felt ordinary anymore. She thought about the men in suits who'd come looking for Bill, about the middle-of-the-night move, about the memorial card that had appeared under her door, unsigned, unexplained. Someone had wanted her at that funeral today. Someone had wanted her to believe Bill was dead. The question was why. The next morning, Margaret did something she hadn't done in months. She went to the library. The Jefferson Branch Public Library sat on the corner of 5th and Madison, a brick building with tall windows and a children's reading room that had been renovated with grant money 5 years earlier. Margaret used to come here every week, back when her eyes were better, and she could lose herself in novels for hours. Now she mostly used the large print section, but today she headed straight for the computer terminals. The librarian, a young man with rectangular glasses and a pride pin on his lanyard, helped her log in. "I need to look up someone," Margaret explained. "An obituary, maybe, or news articles." "Do you know the name?" "James William Foster. He died this week." The librarian nodded and showed her how to access the newspaper database. Margaret thanked him and settled in, her reading glasses perched on her nose, her fingers awkward on the keyboard. It took her 40 minutes and 3 false starts, but she finally found it. James William Foster, 74, of Riverside, passed away peacefully on October 20, 2025, at Riverside Care Center. Born in Richmond, Virginia, on March 14, 1951, James was a devoted father, grandfather, and friend. He served honorably in the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War and spent his career as an accountant with Morrison and Associates. James is survived by his daughter, Jennifer Foster Martinez, his son-in-law, Roberto Martinez, and 3 grandchildren. A memorial service will be held on October 24 at Riverside Memorial Chapel. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to the Wounded Warrior Project. Margaret read the obituary 3 times, her eyes tracing each word, looking for something that didn't fit. But it all fit. Every detail Jennifer had mentioned, every fact the pastor had recited. This James William Foster was exactly who they said he was. So who was Bill? She typed another search. William Foster, Riverside. Dozens of results. Too many. She refined the search, adding age, adding location, adding keywords. Nothing. She tried Bill Foster disappearance. More nothing. She tried Foster missing person report. Still nothing. Frustrated, Margaret sat back in her chair, rubbing her temples. Maybe she was chasing ghosts. Maybe Bill had simply been an old man who told stories to pass the time, who invented a more interesting life than the one he had, and who left town for reasons that had nothing to do with her. Maybe the memorial card had been a mistake, wrong address, wrong Margaret Chen. Maybe... Her phone buzzed in her purse. She pulled it out, expecting spam. Instead, she saw a text from an unknown number. "Stop asking questions. It's not safe." Margaret's blood ran cold. She stared at the message, her hands shaking. Who was this? How did they get her number? She typed back, "Who is this?" No response. She waited 5 minutes, 10, nothing. Margaret glanced around the library, suddenly paranoid. The other patrons looked harmless. A teenager with headphones, an elderly man reading the newspaper, a mother with 2 small children in the kids section. But someone was watching her. Someone knew she was looking for Bill. She gathered her things quickly, her heart pounding, and left the library. For 2 days, Margaret did nothing. She stayed in her apartment, doors locked, curtains drawn. She screened her calls. She ignored the mail. She ate canned soup and stale crackers and told herself she was being ridiculous, paranoid, foolish. But the text message stayed on her phone like a bruise. "Stop asking questions. It's not safe." On the 3rd day, there was a knock at her door. Margaret froze, her spoon halfway to her mouth, chicken noodle soup cooling in the bowl on her lap. The knock came again, firmer this time. "Mrs. Chen, it's Miguel, from downstairs." Relief flooded through her. She set the soup aside and went to the door, checking the peephole first, old habits, Thomas's voice in her head, before unlatching the chain.
Miguel stood in the hallway, his superintendent's uniform wrinkled, his expression apologetic. "Sorry to bother you," he said, "but someone left this for you. They asked me to make sure you got it personally." He held out a manila envelope, unmarked, unsealed. Margaret's stomach tightened. Who left it? Guy in a suit, didn't give his name, said it was important. What did he look like? Miguel shrugged. I don't know, 50-something, white guy, forgettable. He gave me $20 to deliver it, so... He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. Margaret took the envelope. "Thank you, Miguel." "You okay, Mrs. Chen? You seem—" "I'm fine," she lied. "Thank you." She closed the door and locked it, her fingers trembling as she opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. Black and white, slightly grainy, like it had been printed from a security camera or surveillance footage. It showed two men standing outside a building Margaret didn't recognize. One man was younger, maybe 40, with dark hair and sharp features. The other was older, gray-haired, with a face Margaret knew as well as her own reflection. Bill, or whoever he really was. Taped to the back of the photograph was a note, handwritten in neat block letters. "His real name is William Garrett. He's been in witness protection for 14 years. James Foster was his cover identity. If you keep looking for him, you'll put him and yourself in danger. Let him go." Margaret sat down heavily on her couch, the photograph still in her hands. Witness protection. The words rearranged everything she thought she knew. Bill, William Garrett, hadn't been an ordinary old man. He'd been hiding. From what? From whom? And James William Foster, the man they'd buried, the man whose funeral she attended, he wasn't Bill. He'd never been Bill. He was just the identity Bill had been living under. A cover story, a mask. But why send her to the funeral? Why let her think Bill was dead? Unless that was the point. Unless someone wanted her, and anyone else who knew Bill, to stop looking for him, to accept his death and move on. Because as long as people believed he was dead, he could disappear completely.
Margaret's hands steadied. Her fear crystallized into something sharper, clearer. Determination. She wasn't going to let this go. It took Margaret 3 more days to find him. She used every resource she had. Outdated phone books, online people searches, social media stalking she barely understood but learned quickly. She called libraries in surrounding counties. She visited the DMV and lied about needing to update her records. She talked to cashiers and postal workers and the woman who ran the corner bodega, asking careful, casual questions about anyone who'd moved in recently, any older men living alone, any new faces. And finally, she got a lead. A man matching Bill's description had rented a small house in Laurel, Maryland, about 40 minutes away. He'd paid cash for 6 months up front and hadn't given much information beyond a fake name, John Miller, and a phone number that probably went to a burner phone. The cashier at the hardware store where he'd bought paint and cleaning supplies remembered him because he'd been chatty, friendly, familiar. Just like Bill. Margaret borrowed her neighbor's car, told Sonia she needed to visit a sick friend, which wasn't entirely a lie, and drove to Laurel on a Tuesday afternoon. The house was small, nondescript, set back from the road with overgrown hedges and a gravel driveway. A blue sedan sat out front, dusty and unremarkable. Margaret parked across the street and waited. For an hour, nothing happened. Then the front door opened, and Bill stepped out. Margaret's breath caught. He looked the same. Same gray hair, same broad shoulders, same way of moving, slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. He walked to the mailbox at the end of the driveway, collected a few letters, and paused. His head turned slightly, scanning the street. Instinct, Margaret realized. Habit. He was checking for threats. She stayed in the car, her heart hammering.
Bill went back inside. Margaret waited another 20 minutes, then got out of the car. Her legs felt unsteady as she crossed the street, climbed the porch steps, and knocked on the door. Silence. She knocked again. "Bill," she called softly, "it's Margaret, from the park." More silence. Then footsteps. The door opened a crack, and Bill's face appeared. Familiar, but different. Wary. Tired. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "I know," Margaret replied, "but I needed to see you. I needed to know you were okay." Bill's jaw tightened. "How did you find me? Does it matter?" For a long moment they stood there, staring at each other through the narrow opening. Then Bill sighed and stepped back, opening the door wider. "You'd better come in." The inside of the house was sparse. A couch, a coffee table, a television that didn't look like it got much use. Boxes still stacked in the corner, unpacked, like he wasn't planning to stay long. Bill gestured to the couch, and Margaret sat. He remained standing, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "I went to your funeral," Margaret said quietly. "Or someone's funeral. James Foster's." Bill exhaled through his nose. I heard about that. They closed the casket. I almost believed it." That was the point. Margaret looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Who are you, really?" Bill was quiet for a long time. Then he sat down in the chair across from her, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "My name is William Garrett," he said. 14 years ago, I testified against some very bad people. People who ran a financial scheme that destroyed lives. Pensions, savings, college funds, gone. I was an accountant for their firm. I saw what they were doing. I went to the FBI. "Witness protection," Margaret said. He nodded. "They gave me a new identity. New name, new history. James William Foster. Vietnam vet, accountant, widower. They set me up in Riverside, gave me a stipend, told me to keep my head down and my mouth shut. And you did?"
"For 14 years, yeah, I did." He paused. "But a few months ago, something changed. One of the men I testified against got out on appeal. His lawyers found a technicality, and suddenly I wasn't safe anymore." Margaret's chest tightened. "So they faked your death. They wanted to. I refused at first. Didn't want to disappear completely. Didn't want to leave." He trailed off, his eyes meeting hers. "Didn't want to leave people behind without saying goodbye. So you moved in the middle of the night instead. It was safer that way, less attention. But the marshals weren't happy. They insisted on staging the funeral, putting out an obituary, making it look real. They used a stand-in body, someone unclaimed, someone whose family couldn't be found. They gave him my name, my cover story, and buried him. That's grotesque." "It's effective," Bill said grimly. "If everyone thinks I'm dead, no one comes looking. I get a clean start. Again. But the memorial card. Someone sent me a memorial card." Bill's expression darkened. "That wasn't the marshals. That was someone else. Someone who wanted to make sure you showed up to the funeral. Maybe to see if you'd ask questions. To gauge whether I'd told anyone who I really was. The men in suits," Margaret said. "The ones who came looking for you. Not marshals. The other side. They're trying to figure out where I went." He leaned back, rubbing his face. "I shouldn't have stayed in Riverside as long as I did. Shouldn't have made connections. But after Dorothy died, after my real wife died, years before I went into witness protection, I was so lonely. And when I met you in the park," he shook his head, "I just wanted to feel normal, to have a friend." Margaret's throat ached. "The stories you told me, were any of them true?" "Some," Bill said. "The important parts. My wife's name really was Dorothy. She really did love mystery novels and bad puns. My daughter," he hesitated, "my daughter doesn't know where I am. The marshals thought it was safer that way.
So I made up Carol in Seattle. I made up a version of my life that felt close enough to real that I could live in it without feeling like a ghost. And now I disappear again, somewhere far from here, somewhere they can't find me." He looked at her, his eyes sad. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I never meant to drag you into this." "You didn't," she said firmly. "I dragged myself into it." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on them. "I'm going to miss our Tuesdays and Thursdays," Margaret said finally, her voice cracking. Bill's face crumpled. "Me too." She stood, and so did he. For a moment, they just stood there, two people who'd found something rare in the unlikeliest of places, knowing they'd never have it again. Then Bill stepped forward and hugged her, quick, fierce, the embrace of someone saying goodbye for the last time. "Thank you," he whispered, "for being my friend." Margaret pulled back, tears streaming down her face. "Take care of yourself, Bill. Or William. Or whoever you are next." "I will." She walked to the door, paused with her hand on the knob. "If you ever get free of this, if you ever get to stop running, I'll find you," he promised. She smiled, even though she didn't believe him. Then she walked out into the autumn afternoon, got into Sonia's borrowed car, and drove away. 2 weeks later, Margaret received a postcard. It was generic, a photo of a beach somewhere warm, with turquoise water and white sand. No return address, no signature. Just 4 words on the back, written in familiar handwriting. "The pigeons miss you." Margaret pinned it to her refrigerator, next to a grocery list and a photo of Thomas. And every Tuesday and Thursday, she went to Morrison Park and sat on their bench. Sometimes she brought breadcrumbs. Sometimes she just sat.
And once, just once, she looked up and saw an older man with gray hair standing at the edge of the park watching her. She blinked, and he was gone. But she smiled anyway. Maybe it wasn't about knowing everything. Maybe it wasn't about understanding every truth or untangling every lie. Maybe it was just about showing up. Tuesday and Thursday. For a friend. So let me ask you something. What would you have done? If you'd walked into that funeral and realized something wasn't right, would you have let it go? Would you have accepted the easiest answer, the safest explanation, and moved on with your life? Or would you have done what Margaret did, followed the thread, asked the uncomfortable questions, risked your own safety for the chance that someone you cared about might still be out there, still be alive? Because here's the thing about stories like this. They're not really about mysteries. They're not about witness protection or fake deaths or men in suits who lurk in shadows. They're about something simpler and infinitely more complicated. They're about connection. About the people we let into our lives even when we don't mean to. About the small, quiet friendships that take root in unexpected places and grow into something that matters more than we ever anticipated. Margaret didn't have to go to that funeral. She didn't have to investigate. She didn't have to risk anything for a man who, by all accounts, had lied to her for years. But she did. Because she recognized something in Bill that maybe she saw in herself. Loneliness, longing, the need to be seen, to be known, to matter to someone. And when you find that, when you find someone who sees you back, who sits with you on a park bench and feeds pigeons and listens to your stories without judgment or expectation, you don't let that go easily. Even when it's dangerous, even when it's foolish, even when the smart thing, the safe thing, would be to walk away. Margaret showed up. She kept showing up. That's the heart of this story. Not the conspiracy, not the fake funeral or the new identity or the men in suits. Just the showing up. So here's my question for you, and I want you to really think about it. Who shows up for you? Who are the people in your life who would knock on doors and make phone calls and drive 40 minutes to a stranger's house just to make sure you're okay? And maybe more importantly, who do you show up for?
Because we live in a world that makes it easy to be invisible, to keep our heads down, to stay safe, to avoid asking the hard questions or making the inconvenient effort. But the people who matter, the Bills and the Margarets of the world, they don't do easy. They do present. They do persistent. They do I see you and I'm not letting go. And if this story taught us anything, it's that showing up, even when it's messy and complicated and scary, is the only thing that really matters in the end. So take a moment today. Think about the people you've been meaning to call, to text, to check on, the friendships you've let slip, the connections you've taken for granted, and then show up. Tuesday and Thursday, or whatever days you choose. Just show up. If you want more stories like this, stories about ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances, about the truth hidden in everyday injustice, about the quiet courage it takes to care about someone when the world tells you not to, then subscribe. Because there are more Bills and Margarets out there than you might think, and their stories deserve to be told.